How's it going, Dan Viens? How many people call you Dan Veins, by the way?
Oh, most. Yeah, Veins, Vines, Veens. Yeah, most people don't guess that it's a 2-syllable name. So.
Yeah, that's
I always know it's me, right? They can butcher it as much as they want to. It's not going to go over my head. I know they're talking about me.
I have this rule with comedy club posters because everybody spells McClain MCCLAIN. And it's like, this is a little bit of like I've heard this story about both Jerry Seinfeld and I think Guns N' Roses. So it could be either of them, two very similar acts.
Oh,
which is the
Seinfeld used to open for Guns N' Roses.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, we all know that. I think they have a collaboration album coming out soon, actually. But they have there's the like story about, and I'm sure it's apocryphal, but it's the story about like getting rid of the green M&Ms, and they don't want any green M&Ms, and the reason is because the reason I've heard, and I think it's a pretty interesting reason, is if the production company at the venue went through the trouble of getting rid of the green M&Ms, they're like, we don't need to check the pyrotechnics. These people are detail oriented. But if they don't, then, and this to me, that the 2 C's in McClain is a canary in the coal mine of a show that's going to have some problems. Like, I'm going to need to drink a Red Bull and make sure I'm on my toes because they're not going to be policing the room. Nobody's getting kicked out. Nobody's being told to shut up. They're not turning the TVs off. They're not turning, they're not having people not play pool or whatever. Like all of some of or all of the pitfalls of comedy are going to be present at that show if there's 2 C's in McClain.
I've never thought about it that way. You just ruined it for so many like appearances that I'll make on other podcasts now because, they usually butcher the last name, which tells me now I'm going to look at it differently. Like you didn't take 30 seconds to click on my channel and see how I say my own name.
Yeah, well, and I even try to do that with obviously like prospects or football players or whatever because there's so many. Yeah, so many like this draft. There's like a couple Nigerian players, for example, and I'm like, I'm not. I got to go hear someone else pronounce this name. I at least want plausible deniability when I mispronounce it because I've heard Fashanu. I've heard Adonai Mitchell has been, that's how I think it's pronounced, but it could be a different way. Like I think everyone calls him AD Mitchell because of this, by the way. Yeah. Johnny Newton has been shrunk to Johnny Newton from Jerzon Newton, all because I feel like people are like, shit, I don't want to mess this up. Like I don't want to pronounce this wrong.
It screws with you too because sometimes it can catch you by surprise if you don't, do the work ahead of time, and you're just like going through a list or you're live and you're talking about a certain guy, and your eyes deceive you. Like just today, I realized I was pronouncing the corner from Michigan, Mike Sanderstill's last name. I was pronouncing it Mike Sanristil, like it was Sanristil, and it's the other way around, and just simple things like that. It's it must drive those guys crazy. But
I also come from like I've also noticed that at a certain age, men just stop trying to pronounce names correctly. Like my father-in-law, Widmer Brewing, he grew up with Widmer Brewing. He's never going to stop calling it Windermere. My uncles, they all called Spokane. They're from Spokane, or they all called Washington. Never attempted to fix it, and eventually they just stopped caring and stopped trying to solve any of these problems.
Well, I heard Klaus Meine of Scorpions pronounce it Spokane one time when I saw them at the Monsters of Rock show many moons ago. So
the people of Spokane get very mad about that, and then phonetically it is Spokane. I can empathize.
On the list of things that people from Spokane get mad about, it's probably pretty far down the list.
I did an interview with a newspaper out there because I headlined a weekend out there a couple of years ago. And I made it like we talked about a controversial comedy topic. I thought we were like just having a casual conversation before the interview. And he's like, okay, got all I need. And I'm like, no. And then I just started trashing Spokane, hoping that would be what made it into the article. And that's what he did. I said something about Spokane that he put as the headline instead of me like ruining my comedy career with an opinion. All right, we should talk about Dan Viens of the Seahawks Forever podcast, formerly, which, by the way, I might be one of few that have come to you since the SB Nation. Whoa, take it easy, Dan. I saw the. I
was wondering if you were going to say you went all the way back to the Dan Cave.
Oh no, I'm much newer than that. Is what I'm saying. I'm post SB Nation breakup. I had a little bit of those like series of because you were involved in Fansided at some point too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was that 12th Man Rising, right? So I was
Sure, yeah.
Co-editor there with Keith Myers and did some stuff for NFL Mocks. I think they were a fan-sided site as well too, and even wrote a story one back in the day for fan-sided about where I ranked the first 16 seasons of American Idol. I ranked their winners, so a little crossover.
Sure.
There.
That's so I was many years ago, I was a like data-driven sports blogger, and I had a little bit of a negative interaction. I was interviewing for the fan-sided job, the Mariners editor job.
Mm-hmm.
And it did not I'm not on your side of the fence, luckily, but I'm not like ambushing you with a shitty thing you did to me. And they just like, we had a weird interaction and then a weird interaction on Twitter. And I've been like, I had an issue with SB Nation also after that. I just lumped them in with all the fan-sided blogs. And so I kind of just ignored field goals for a long time. And then I started listening to your podcast this offseason, and it's amazing. You do quality's incredible. The work is incredible. The editing is great. It's informative without being like, these aren't hot takes. You're not like dumping hot takes on everybody to be controversial, right?
I appreciate it. It's nice when you set out with an intention to do something a certain way. And my intention wasn't contrived at all. It's just who I am. It's how I see the game. And when I first started podcasting 7 or 8 years ago, I didn't know if anyone would ever listen, but I just wanted to do it for me because I had a need to discuss these things in a certain way, in sort of a thoughtful, analytical way. And I just didn't have enough people in my personal life where I could exercise those muscles. And now that this incarnation of my show has begun to grow, it's attracted an audience of people who like that particular approach, which just makes it even more fun for me because now there's more engagement and more debate and more discussion, which is what I really get off on. So it's nice to hear that. I really appreciate that. Thanks. I hate that style, do what you're going to do. Right. But like I not grew up on it because it was kind of the mid 90s that it blew up, but like ESPN was the mothership. And I watched SportsCenter every night and I watched all their NFL shows, and I haven't watched ESPN or Fox Sports for anything other than live programming for 6 or 7 years. I can't stand contrived, forced, fake hot takes. And so, if that's what you do and you make money doing it, there's a lot of Seahawks based channels out there with a shit ton of subscribers, more than I have. And they do that, and they do the clickbait thing, and, do what you got to do. There's obviously an audience out there for it, but I'd rather grow a lot more slower and more steady and attract like-minded people. So I'm having fun doing it. I appreciate the thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think about that stuff a lot because there's a bunch there. You're right. There's a lot out there. There's a lot with a lot of followers. And I feel like some of them are just people who are kind of doing it accidentally. And your podcast is obviously very deliberate. And I appreciate that also. Like effort isn't attractive all the time. You know what I mean? Like it's watching someone work hard isn't all you want to see a prodigy. Dan Viens, I don't think you're a prodigy. I think you and I are both too old to be prodigies at this point in our lives. I think that you work really hard at it, and that's something that I really appreciate seeing. So anyway, I'm done kissing your ass for a moment because I'd like to.
No, that's the show, right? I mean, I can go now.
I will say one thing I was rooting for you on is when you kind of, I wouldn't say broke, but like made more amplified the Ryan Grubb to Seattle rumor. One, I'm a Huskies fan. I was hoping it would happen. Yeah. And then watching the like cycle of it seems like it's going to happen. Now it seems like it's not going to happen publicly anyway. It seems like what happened is, there was like a delay in the process. They probably wanted to have Mike McDonald in place before they were going to hire his offensive coordinator. Now Grubb has to awkwardly address the Alabama Booster Club. Like it's everybody got screwed on that, including for like a couple weeks, your reputation, and then you come out obviously pretty strong on the other end of it, right?
Yeah, that was an exciting time. Like I didn't intend for it to be that way. It's just, look, I'm not in the reporting business anymore. It's been decades since I did that, and so I don't ever pretend to do that. And that's talk about list of pet peeves. There are accounts out there who pretend that they're reporters and they're merely just stealing other people's hard work, right?
Yeah, I've seen you call those people out.
Yeah, and I'll continue to do that. That's just the old, journalism major and former broadcaster in me. But all I did in that case is, first of all, it started out as connecting dots, right? Like the initial smoke was that it made sense, and it was a connection that very well could happen. And then it didn't happen initially, and so we went through all the machinations of like, God, where are we going to go now, and all the overthinking of the whole process. And then a couple things happened like really quickly. First of all, Whitney, who I've followed, and we followed each other on Twitter. People that are in Seahawks Twitter certainly, I'm sure, know Whitney, whether they are pro or con. She's very strong in her opinions. I love that about her. She knew someone personally who was close to the situation. So it was secondhand information, and I presented it as such. Actually, I don't think when I heard it from her, I didn't jump on it right away. But then I heard at almost the same time, within 24 hours, independently from two other people, one through Twitter and one directly in person. Same thing, same exact thing. I know him. I know the situation. I'm close to it, and it's probably going to happen. And so that's when I communicated it. And my God, the backlash. I mean, once the people, and I think this is sort of amplified by and nurtured by that hot take culture that we were talking about. People want to take sides. It's black or white. That's it. And they don't want to believe something. And so they will continue to pound at what they think is fact, because it's the intended outcome that they prefer. And they came after me. Man, you're an idiot and you're wrong, and this and that, every word you can think of. So I don't feel comfortable taking victory laps and patting myself on the back. It's just not really my nature, my personality. I may feel it inwardly, but I don't like to present myself that way.
Sure.
It was pretty hard not to in that case, and I actually did kind of enjoy it.
Yeah, I believe that. It's there's very little more satisfying than getting like a silent revenge that everybody that shit talked to you on social media had to feel pretty stupid at some point. Did anybody reach out to be like, I was a dickhead, I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
good. That's great.
Hey, you were right. I was wrong. Should have seen the tea leaves or whatever. And look, let's be honest. A lot of the people that came after me were Bama fans.
Yeah.
They just didn't want to believe it. Right? Or they were Seahawk fans who didn't think a college coordinator was the right call. And so they had that, they were emotionally invested in it, in that way. It was kind of similar to, if you remember last year, shortly before the draft, Brady Henderson and Corbin Smith were the two that about a week or two before the draft were really on, hey, I think Devin Witherspoon is in play at 5. And they were just ostracized. You're nuts. The Seahawks have never taken a corner high. They're never going to take a corner high, no matter what. I'm not willing to listen to any of the other arguments. And they were, turned out they were right. And a lot of people had to eat crow.
Yeah, I was one of them. I was one of the more successful reels for this podcast. We did like a reel on Instagram, was me admitting to having pounded the table on both, not only on Devin Witherspoon, but also on Jackson Smith and Jigba. They're not taking a receiver in the first round. There's no way. And yeah.
So were you were a Jalen Carter guy then?
I didn't know that I actually thought they were going to end up with what is it, Tyree?
Oh yeah,
Tyree Smith. Yeah, Tyree Smith. And I'm not saying, I think he'll still be a fine player, and he seems like this is me like
Wilson Smith.
Wilson. It's Wilson.
Yeah.
Hold on. He plays for the Raiders, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Tyree Wilson.
I went through a period where I thought he was the guy too. And this is an example where I had to admit I was wrong, because people came at me and said, hey, the tape isn't all there. The production's not there. He's just all traits and he's all motor and he's nothing else. And, thank God we didn't take him.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and yeah, Devin Witherspoon's amazing. He was injured for a big chunk of the year, right? And I think like he's a guy, he's like a weird scheme versatile. Scheme versatile can also mean like there's no spot for him in either scheme, but he's like, is he an edge? Is he a 4-3 defensive end? He's kind of got to pick a weight direction and go that way. And I like that kind of a guy. And I have a couple guys that I want to talk to you about that are similar to that today. But I want to talk to you about Michael Penix, who's obviously he's the topic du jour almost every jour in Seattle. We if you're a Huskies fan, you really care about where he's going to get drafted. I'm sure that many Seahawks fans are very divided on whether they want him to play for the Seahawks. I would love to see them find a way to get him there. I don't think they're going to be able to move that far back. I personally think he's going to be drafted in the first round at this point, and I want to fight against it a little bit if you say no, but do you think, like, probabilistically, how likely do you think it is that Michael Penix Jr. gets drafted in the first round?
I think it's probable at this point. I think the closer you get to the draft, buzz matters, and it's more and more accurate these days than ever. As much as teams try to veil their intentions, it's not just the things. It's not just the talent. It's not just the arms. Not just the production. It's the things you start to hear now about what they're saying about his ability to lead, and how he captures the locker room, and how dudes love him, because that's, I think we've seen so many quarterback busts and missed picks over the last 5-10 years, and teams are more willing to move on from those quickly when they make mistakes now, and you can with the rookie salary wage cap. And I think that when you go back and you look at the busts, you look at the Trey Lances and the Zach Wilsons and the guys that were taken high that didn't work out, and that's probably the missing ingredient. They all had talent. It's what's above the neck, and it's as much as it is about heart too, and those are not a question about Michael Penix. And I think he's answered the physical stuff too, which was a real huge question going into this draft season. And he's just checked every box. He's done everything right. And I think, halfway, there was a point last season where he was a no doubt first rounder, and then he fell out of that, the concerns about age and the injury history. And now I feel like he's firmly back. Like, now I'm not so sure. I don't know, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said Bo Nix for sure in the first round, Penix maybe not. And maybe that was wishful thinking as a Seahawks fan, that I was kind of hoping he'd fall.
Yeah.
But now I think it's the other way around, where I'm not so sure Nix goes in the first round now, which might explain why the Seahawks are meeting with him this week.
It seems like Penix, McCarthy, JJ McCarthy, and even Bo Nix to a degree, maybe not physically, but like in the process, the interview process and all the reporting I've heard on it, those dudes are all like A+, 100%, like perfect post-season, like draft lead-up process guys. Like JJ McCarthy, and I've had the same renaissance on JJ McCarthy that a lot of people have, where I was like, I mean, the guy's like a barely throws the ball, and then I've watched him and enjoyed it. The every interview you see, the guy feels like he can lead men also. I love watching Michael Penix talk. I think he's so engaging, and like, I think he's everything you want out of a quarterback. I think JJ McCarthy is also everything you want out of a quarterback, and people still want to discount McCarthy's arm strength. And then to me, I just keep going back to that. And I don't think a lot of people saw it during the combine, but it was that they just had a radar gun on him and Joe Milton. And he was 1 mile an hour slower than Joe Milton, who has a rocket arm and very little else skill wise. And he's like, throwing the ball 80 yards, and he's like, the consensus, he's got the strongest arm in the draft. JJ McCarthy throws the ball 1 mile an hour slower than that guy.
Yeah, I don't know what it is that makes people skeptical, like vehemently skeptical of JJ McCarthy as a product. Like, they get angry. Similar to I remember last year when I pretty early on in the process, not necessarily because I dug into the film and discovered it on my own, but what other people were saying, that I thought, you better get used to the fact that Anthony Richardson's going to be a top 10 pick, because some team's going to fall in love with him. He's going to go that high. And the backlash on that was pretty severe, just because the numbers weren't there. But for some reason, people decided, maybe it's just the haircut. I don't know. It's the boy band look, that they just don't want to like JJ McCarthy.
He's Jimmy Clausen 2.0.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe they just don't like skinny calves. But then you wouldn't like Jaden Daniels either. So they have that in common this year. But it's everything he does, just he makes it look so easy. And if you're going to knock him because they didn't throw the ball very much, well, it was because they didn't have to. And Jim Harbaugh is never a guy that's going to throw it 50 times a game because, well, I want my quarterback's draft stock to be higher, right? And somebody came at me with a pretty informed, thoughtful debate point a couple weeks ago, they said, well, look, he had Andrew Luck at Stanford and they threw the ball a ton. And I said, well, it's because you didn't have anything else. Like they had to, like that's
Right.
what they did well. But at Michigan, they had, I think, top of my head, is just in 2023, I think they had a double-digit lead in 11 of their games, right? And if you look at the splits, like they threw it 60% of the time in the first half, and then guess what happened in the second half, right?
Yeah.
But then you also look at the numbers of when they were in obvious throwing situations, when the defense knows what's coming, 3rd and longs, and his numbers are off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
And if you question his arm strength, that's a funny one. I've even seen some of these professional scouting services that some will say mediocre arm, acceptable arm, and others will say A+ arm. It's weird how, one person can see something one way and another. But I think it's because he's one of those guys, unlike, say, a Will Levis last year, where he doesn't just throw fastballs all the time. He understands when he needs to do what. And there are throws on tape. National championship game, first time they really threw it downfield, guy runs a flag route 30 yards downfield, and he puts it right perfectly on his back, on his outside shoulder. Absolute NFL throw, dime, and he just flicks his wrist. Like it's just easy.
He kind of reminds me a little bit of, and I say this also because, and I hope I've learned my lesson on this, but like before he got drafted, Russell Wilson was like everything you want, but he's 5'10".
Right.
He's everything you want, but and it's like JJ McCarthy's everything you want except for he played on a team with 18 combine invites or whatever, like a team that was so loaded with talent and had one of the best coaches in the history of football that was leading that team, that he didn't need to throw the ball 45 times a game. And I understand how that can make you skeptical, but how you penalize him for that is confusing to me.
Yeah, they're so loaded, and they didn't have to open it up and be wide open on offense. They beat you to death on defense, and they ran the football. They played physical because that was really their strength. So I mean, Blake Corum is as decorated as he is. Like he's the second best running back talent wise on that team. Like his backups might be one of the top 3 running backs taken in next year's draft. Like that's how deep they were. They had 6 offensive linemen that are probably going to be drafted this year, and you only play 5 offensive linemen at a time. So I mean, do the math. Like they're pretty good.
Yeah, I think that the arm strength thing with him kind of reminds me a little bit also of the. I remember there's so many articles I read about Michael Penix, and I've watched every Michael Penix snap in purple and gold. Like I'm a Huskies fan. I've watched every single game. I knew I didn't know he was going to run 4.4, 4.5, whatever the official time. I didn't know he was going to run 4.6. Actually, 4.6 seemed pretty plausible to me. Because I've seen him run. I've seen him. There's been a couple times where we've gotten to see Michael Penix be an athlete with the ball in his hand, and it's there. He doesn't do it very, very often, and that might be a self-preservation thing, which is something you want from him. So one, I knew he was going to be a better athlete than they thought, but another thing that's bothered me through this whole process is they go, the only thing that matters is the medicals. Because of the medicals, a bunch of people, it reminds me of Shark Tank when it's like, for the TV, they have to say a reason they don't like this guy. They can't quite put their finger on what it is. And they go, it's the medicals. He's a 2nd or 3rd rounder to me. Leatu Latu has a arguably worse medical background than Michael Penix. And people are like, this guy might be the best edge rusher in the draft. No question. Again, they go, if it wasn't for the medicals, maybe he'd be the top edge rusher picked and he might be the 3rd edge rusher picked. But nobody's like, he's a day 2, day 3 guy because of his arguably worse medicals at a significantly less important position than quarterback.
It's a double standard, right? Like nowadays, if you look at an established pro, like Jordan Brooks tears his ACL last December, and he starts week 1 and he looks as good physically, if not better than ever, at the age of 25, 26 years old. So like the advancements in medicine and surgery is unbelievable. Like ACLs used to be career threatening, or it would at least rob you of an entire year. But now we're holding that against a kid who's 24, who's now 4 years removed from his last ACL surgery, and
who's also showing that his knees are healthy enough to run 4.5 and to jump 36 inches or 37 inches, whatever.
And the shoulders are obviously okay because he got the shit kicked out of him during the national championship game. He just kept getting up and kept playing. He's not fragile, right? He had fluky injuries. This used to drive me crazy about Rashad Penny. People would say he's fragile or injury prone. All the injuries he suffered were like broken legs, right? Like major ACLs. And those aren't things because you have weak soft tissue. It's just,
or you're not tough.
Sport. Right. And he's put 2 years now behind him where he's been healthy. I don't think it helped. There's like a perception thing. I talked about this with Emery Hunt last week. Great. Writes the football game plan draft guide. And about just the perception. Sometimes guys in college, just based on the way they wear their uniforms or the pads they wear, or sometimes even just the look of the uniform, their school's colors, they look bigger or smaller or slower or faster than they really are. And Penix has this weird kind of build. He has a short neck. He wears these, it looks like he grabbed a pair of shoulder pads from the 90s. Like he wears them up higher. It doesn't help perception probably that he insisted on wearing the knee brace all the time.
Sure.
But he didn't when he was doing these off-season workouts and stuff. So I'm not worried about the medicals. We'll see. It'd be one thing if, let's say the Seahawks bring him in for physicals, which I guarantee you they've done. It just doesn't need to be publicized because he's a local kid.
Mm-hmm.
You do a scan on a guy's knee and you see something degenerative. There's cartilage missing or whatever. Like that was an issue with Tyjae Spears last year. That's one thing. Like the structure of his shoulders just isn't good. He's going to be more likely to get hurt. Anything less than that, just the fact that he got hurt before shouldn't eliminate a guy. Look at Nick Chubb, for crying out loud. Talk about a guy with 2 major ACLs in college, still put together a damn near Hall of Fame career before he got hurt again.
Yeah, we'll see what his comeback from that is. He's obviously a little bit older and plays that's the other thing too is Michael Penix has taken some beatings in his career. And I mean, really, like I would say this year, again, it's like I just am a little bit close to the forest on this one. So I can, after the Oregon game, I think he probably had a broken rib. I think he was in a lot of pain. He was, and he played he went from being nobody can stop Michael Penix to he was like a human being playing quarterback. And then that Texas game, he had time to recover and not get hit every week leading up to it. He had a little bit of time and he was removed from that injury enough. And he was amazing against Texas. And then this thing that people are doing with him where they're like, well, he got, he played so bad against Michigan. It's like, well, he never had time. Like, and I understand he had one of the league's best offensive lines or one of college's best offensive lines, but they were getting dominated that day. Like he didn't do that. And maybe I guess the thing to me that also bothers me, and I'm a big Ryan Grubb fan, but if you're going to penalize Michael Penix for not getting the ball out quickly against Michigan, how do you also be excited about Ryan Grubb, who didn't create an opportunity for Michael Penix to get the ball out quickly against Michigan? You know what I mean?
It's valid, and we're going to see. There are concerns. Albert Breer was on a podcast last week, and he said the things that he's hearing, he heard from 2 different scouts or 2 different coaches who said associated with the Michigan program that like they dared him to throw the ball in the middle of the field. That was their game plan, and he couldn't do it. Is that a blind spot of his? Is that a Ryan Grubb blind spot? Like I'm a sicko, but I haven't gone back and looked at Fresno State tape. Like was Jake Haener carving things up in the middle of the field when he was throwing for 4,500 yards? I don't know. I suspect maybe he was because that's more his game. He doesn't have the arm that Michael Penix does. So we'll find out. It could be a weakness in his game, certainly.
You have behind you have a Richard Sherman jersey, who's my favorite Seahawk of all time. And you have, I believe, a Dan Viens jersey, number 11, which is, I believe, a Washington.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my question.
That was my high school number. And then that's, I went to Washington State. I'm a proud kid.
Right.
And so I just had, and I actually ordered that custom jersey a couple years ago with the intention that I'd wear it when I go watch a Cougar game or whatever. But the sizing was so inconsistent. It was just way too tight when I got it. So I thought it would make a good background. And then I can't see it on the split
Baldwin on the other
here.
one, right?
Yeah, and then a Doug Baldwin. Yeah,
yeah. We'll give you a quick shot of the Baldwin there.
Yep.
Yeah, 3 just amazing guys. I'm curious. So I think Michael Penix has a chance to be a very good player. If I was going to make my most like, if I was going to make my hottest take, give you my hottest take, my least responsible opinion about this year's draft, it's one, I'm taking Roma Dunze over everybody else in this, every other receiver in this draft, and I think Roma Dunze is going to be a Hall of Famer. I'm saying that now. He's going to, and I think part of the reason is, and I'm curious if you've seen this also, and I've been fooled before. Like when TJ Houshmandzadeh came to Seattle, you're like, oh, it's the reasonable, normal guy from that Cincinnati receiving duo / trio. If Chris Henry was also pretty productive. Rest in peace, Chris Henry. But you're like, it's the normal guy, not the insane diva. And then TJ Houshmandzadeh got here, and he was an insane diva. It was like he'd been being suppressed by Chad Ochocinco. And every time I watch Roma Dunze talk, and you hear the stories about him staying after at the combine, trying to get this, was it like the 3-cone drill? He was trying to get it down to
short shuttle. Yeah, just kept running it over and over again.
Yeah, he just wanted to get down to a certain time that he had in his mind, and he's so competitive, and you listen to him talk, and he's so intelligent, and he seems so like mellow-mannered and cerebral about football that I'm like, this is everything. I mean, he's kind of everything Larry Fitzgerald was, and also with the physical traits that get him compared to Larry Fitzgerald. But like Larry Fitzgerald is, one of the smartest football players arguably that's ever played, in a body that could just catch everything, that could open himself up if he wasn't open. Do you see, I mean, tell me why I'm wrong. Ultimately, a lot of this, I just want you to tell me why I'm wrong. I was hoping you'd have something on Penix. Now I want something on a Dunze.
Yeah, I'm not so sure you are. I've certainly, as a Coug, saw him carve us up a couple of times, and especially the game in Pullman 2 years ago. My God, that was a perfect example of, and this is one of the things that, a little side note here, that excites me about Ryan Grubb, that I think has been lacking in Seahawks offensive coordinators going back probably all the way to Darrell Bevell, is when you sense blood in the water, you strike, right? And when you sense a weakness on the other defense, you just keep pounding away at that weakness until they prove they can stop it. And that was a great example of that. Like that day, we could not cover them deep, and we couldn't get to Penix either. And he just kept throwing bomb after bomb. There are teams out there. I saw another report the other day that there are teams that have a Dunze over Harrison. And if I'm a team, I know this might be trite, and maybe, if we look back 10 years from now, because I think this is going to become more common, where players don't do all the testing and they opt out of this stuff. And maybe we'll look back 10 years from now and it won't matter. But it would bother me as a GM. Like, I want dudes, and we know that this is the type of mindset and profile that the Seahawks look for, and that John Schneider's drawn to. Is they want dogs, and they want guys that have a passion for playing football. They don't really, if you're Marvin Harrison and you're supposed to be the best wide receiver prospect in years, why don't you believe in yourself enough to go out there and test, right?
Well, not even test. He didn't even do wasn't even at the event, right?
Yeah, didn't do any of it, right? Even at his own pro day, like nothing. Right. Was resting on his laurels, which the tape's great, but I'm now, and listen, I'm not dogging the guy, because everything else you hear is that nobody works harder. This guy is an animal in the weight room. He puts in all the work. He studies the film. He's devoted to football, but I just can't reconcile those two things.
Yeah, especially, and I know this is unfair because he is not his dad. Although I do think that he gets a lot of benefit from being Marvin Harrison Sr.'s son, benefit of the doubt in people's mind on talent and all that. And to me, there was a thing, and I'm not talking about, I understand there's the murder charges against Marvin Harrison Sr. That's not what I'm talking about necessarily, though that is, theoretically, if you're giving him credit for the talent, why not discount him for the character? But what we started to hear this always blew my mind. When the murder charges came out, we'd also hear he was an asshole to everybody. Like, he was abusive to team, like equipment staff. And you're like, well, one, why didn't we hear any of this stuff while he was playing, if it's true? And two, that's the stuff to me that's more like you're starting to see this kind of pattern of weird stuff because Marvin Harrison Sr., that was the story, is like he's out there running routes. Him and Peyton Manning are out playing, or out running routes after everyone else is gone. That was the story you heard. And I don't think that absolves him of like these like kind of odd character decisions he's making.
Yeah,
You know?
I don't know. It just makes the evaluation process so much more challenging because you have to consider that, even these guys, it's one thing I understand to a point. And this bothered me when it first started happening, but I think I've come to peace with it. The guys that opt out of bowl games.
Yeah.
Because you'd love for a guy to be so competitive that he'd want to play no matter what. But man, when you got millions on the line and career ahead of you or whatever, and you go to play a game that's, maybe not necessarily even one of the final four, right? That's a meaningless bowl game, essentially. Like, I kind of get it. But the quarterbacks, it bothers me when they don't throw. So what if you go out and you have a bad day? You're throwing to guys that aren't your receivers, right? Yeah. It's a workout that's not scripted, it's not planned. So you have a bad day throwing the ball. You still get a chance to rebound at your pro day. And at the end of the day, if you have the traits and you have the tape, you're not going to go from a top 5 pick. If Jaden Daniels or Drake May had a bad day at the combine, which they probably wouldn't have, they're not going to drop out of the top 20. Like, I just that part bothers me. I hate that.
Yeah, I agree with it, and it's kind of one of those things where I'm like, it's kind of like the NIL stuff where you're like, it's ruining everything, and also I completely get it, and if I was in their shoes, I'd probably do the same thing,
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Odunze is probably going to go top 6, top 9, something like that. Let's say he falls to Seattle at 16. Obviously, they don't need a receiver, but if they're truly drafting best player available, it's hard to imagine that Rome Odunze is not the best player available at 16. Let's say he falls there in some fluke. I guess there's like 2 parts of this. One is he's kind of the inverse of DK Metcalf, in that like Metcalf is this athletic freak that's incredibly competitive to a fault. Like in a very non-cerebral way is he competitive. He is toxically competitive. He's got DK Metcalf probably has all the traits that they talk about Michael Jordan, and like the won't leave the locker room until he's won a game of chess or checkers or whatever it was. Like, right. He's got all that stuff. And then also, a skill set that's limited, but athletic ability that makes that not matter, right? Like, he's just so amazingly gifted. So there's 2 questions of this. All off season I've heard, if you trade DK Metcalf, you're not going to save any money. There's nothing left now that they're. I looked at Over the Cap, and I looked at Spot Track. I guess I need to hear someone else say that name also. Anyway, it seems like the Seahawks would save some money on the 2024 cap, even if they didn't use a post-June 1st designation, which I'm not even sure of all the rules on that. But like, I figured $9 million based on what I saw, which isn't enough to go sign a DK Metcalf caliber receiver.
Right.
But so there's a couple things. There's I'm triangulating to a question. One is, Odunze falls to you at 16. Are you fine with the Seahawks taking him? 2, do you think I'm right? And I'm willing to let you search briefly if you'd like to. And also, we saw Stephon Diggs get traded last week. A 2nd-round pick with like a future 2nd-round pick, and then some future picks to offset it. I think a 5th and 6th rounder. And then the Bills are taking a huge cap hit, which is to say that Stephon Diggs was not worth a ton in the trade market. I have to imagine because of his age and his contract situation, DK Metcalf is probably and his size is probably worth a little bit more. Do you think the Seahawks can get a 1st-round pick for DK Metcalf if they were to trade him? And then I guess the last thing is, do you think it's a horrible idea to trade DK Metcalf?
So they won't get a 1st-round pick for him, not this year, because it's about the market, right? It's about whether it's a buyer's or seller's market, and it seems to be an annual narrative. It's another really strong, extremely strong wide receiver group. And so why are you going to trade for a guy that has a cap hit of $24.5 million when you can draft a guy on a rookie contract, right? And so this idea, and I know, there's a local radio host here who's been front and center kind of pounding the table saying they should consider it because they can get a 1st-round pick, and there's value in that. Certainly there is, but the market isn't there. And we've seen that. We saw Keenan Allen traded for a 4th, right? We saw Amari Cooper trade a couple years ago for a 5th, I think. They're not, these are elite wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins didn't get a huge return. I think the last receiver that really got significant draft return, I think Julio Jones but did he even get a first? Tyreek Hill did.
AJ Brown.
Tyreek Hill got a first-round pick, right? AJ Brown got a first-round pick.
Yeah, I believe that's right.
It'd be interesting now to go back and look at those wide receiver draft classes and see kind of how those fell. So that part of the question, I never considered that a real possibility. Now, next year, going in the last year of his deal, right? It's still in the prime of his career physically. Seahawks are up against the cap next year. They're going to be in a position where they have a bunch of guys on 1-year deals this year. They're going to need to move some things around. You know, they may be looking at the possibility of either extending him to lower his cap number and paying him another big contract, or potentially trading him in the last year of his deal. But then that's going to mitigate your return too. So I never really took those suggestions seriously because I didn't think the market was really there. And also, the dude's just a beast. And I still want to see what he can do with a really good offensive coordinator, which he hasn't had.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so I think the second half of last season, we saw him take a step forward. I think we saw less penalties, we saw fewer outbursts, and we saw a little bit of an expanded game. Like there were key throw after key throw late in that season where he's running those kind of Rams-ish 15-yard in-breaking routes, and Geno was just going to him all day. He's catching the ball in traffic, contested catches, really physical at the point of attack. I'm not ready to move on from that yet because that can be pretty dynamic, right?
Yep.
Now, you're a Dunze question. I'm glad that you brought it up because this taps into a general philosophy that I've always had, and I feel like most good NFL GMs have, and fans, there's a disconnect out there that fans just don't understand, no matter how much a guy like John Schneider goes on the radio every week and talks about it, the difference between need today and how you acquire talent long-term and how you succeed in the NFL. And, you know, I've suggested that very idea that especially if they trade down, when you start to look at how this draft is stacking up, the quarterbacks are going to go first. And then those offensive tackles are going to start to go because it's an outstanding tackle group. And mixed into that, you're going to get some receivers. But this receiver group is so deep that there's some really, really exciting dudes that are going to get pushed down in the second half of the first round. So maybe it's not as big an issue at 16 unless someone like a Dunze falls, which I don't see happening. But if they trade down, you might get a guy. You might get a Brian Thomas that falls down into that range, or, you know, just Xavier Worthy. I mean, some of these guys that blew up the combine and just really dynamic athletes.
I have a similar affliction to you on mock drafts. I don't publish them because they're embarrassing, but for me, because I'm like, anyways, I had A.D. Mitchell in one earlier, and I'm like, oh man, this guy's like would be exciting. I would be excited if a guy like that. I mean, I think Xavier Worthy, I'm scared of the weight. I'm scared of being so small in the NFL, but there are receivers that if they drafted him in the first round, especially now that the world of possibilities of first round receivers has been opened by JSN, I'm like, maybe there's a guy out there that I'd be that thrilled about, you know?
When John Schneider says they're going to take best player available, whoever's at the top of their board, he means it, right? Yeah. And again, especially if they trade down, if they take a receiver, fans will lose their minds because they'll say, what? We don't need one. We have Tyler, we have DK, we have JSN. Never mind that two of them have massive cap hits. One of them will be on an expiring contract next year. The other one's 32 years old. He's on the wrong side of 30, and we've seen that decline in his game. You can never just think you're set. You know, you just can't. You have to plan for the future. And so, if a Dunze somehow falls to 16, my first question is why? Like, what's wrong? Right? Like, what do we don't know? I think he'd be high on their board. And if they truly, truly go by best player available, right? It's everybody wants us to take a guard in the first round because that's the most glaring need. But I'm telling you, and I'll continue to say it from now until the 25th over and over and over again, you have to look at the entirety of the draft and the different layers in the draft. And you follow me enough to know that I'm a nut job when it comes to mock drafts, right?
Yeah.
Like I have a problem. It's when you take a guard early, the cupboard gets really bare really quickly at all the other positions that fans want us to fill, right? Like the edges are gone in the third round. The defensive tackles are gone. You got role players after that. The receivers are picked through. The corners are gone. There's some safeties, and you can tap into the linebackers there and get some value, but it doesn't work. But if you take one of those other positions early, right? You address the defensive front, or you take a skill position guy or a secondary guy. Talk to Paul Moyer about that possibility today. You can still turn around in the third, fourth round and be like, oh, I like the shopping list here. There's some plug and play day one starters on the interior offensive line on day 2 and 3. But there aren't. If you flip it around the other way, it's kind of scary.
Yeah. Yeah, I have that same feeling, and I think like I've seen a lot of the Fautanu people are like, it's a no-brainer, makes perfect sense. And to me, I'm like, it's another situation where I'm like, this is just a situation where people are going, the Seahawks need a guard, so that's obviously what they're going to draft. There's a very good guard prospect here. Maybe he's arguably the best prospect on the board for a lot of these people. I kind of am of the mind. I mean, John Schneider said he doesn't value guards as highly as the rest of the league, basically. Most of the time when he says something, I kind of think we should believe him because he's remarkably honest for a guy who's trying to send smoke screens out and subvert his own,
Yeah. And I feel like he's become a lot more open since he started doing that weekly radio show this time of year.
Yeah.
He started doing that last year, and I feel like he's even more comfortable in it now. And he offers more than he used to. So, we can start to connect some dots. Now, I agree with you. I love Fautanu. Absolutely love him. I think he's a future All-Pro, especially at guard. I think he's a culture setter. He's a tone setter. And if you take him, if he falls to 16, you take him all day long, you run to the podium, and I'm not mad about that at all. But when you start to think about what's the difference if you move down into the 20s, is the difference between Fautanu and Graham Barton that severe? Right? Or is the difference between a Graham Barton and a Cooper Beebe or a Mason McCormick or a Christian Haynes or a Christian Mahogany later on in the third round, maybe if they fall that far? That's where you have to start to weigh some of the opportunity cost if you don't go another position.
Yeah. Okay, I have a couple scheme fit questions. This is the hardest thing for me to understand in football because and I'm going to let you correct my pronunciation on this. Edifuan Ulafosio, how close? How close was my pronunciation first off? That's what I'm saying. And then I have some questions about his scheme fit.
I think you're as close as I would get. Yeah. I was watching some combine stuff again the other day, and they put a little more emphasis on the last part of the name. It was more Elafashio, that kind of thing. So yeah, we can just call him the UW inside linebacker.
Yeah, so that's I've seen him listed so sporadic. I've seen him listed as an edge, and the Will Mike Sam dynamic, and then these modern offenses. Like I understood what the two inside linebackers in a 3-4 did. I understand what they did in a 4-3, but we've got these hybrid blended defense. I might have said offense earlier. I meant defense, obviously. We have these defenses that are blended concepts, and what Mike McDonald's going to do, and it's part of this is just me going through. This guy has crushed every workout. He's one of the most without maybe having incredible tape necessarily has crushed every workout. He's one of the most athletic inside linebackers, not super undersized compared to some of the other guys you might see. Is he a scheme fit? Is this a guy I in the mock drafts I do, he ends up in the 7th round. It seems to me a guy with his athletic prowess, somebody's going to take a risk on him earlier. What do you think the future holds, and does he fit the Seahawks? What the Seahawks are going to do?
I think he does, because I think this new era of what the defense is going to look like at Lumen Field is less about the traditional Sam and Will roles as it is guys that are interchangeable and guys that can both cover. When you look at, there was a question when they acquired Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker, which guy's going to be the Mike, because neither one of them is obvious.
Right.
And that's why I think he fits, as I look at, and you're right, when you watch the tape, it's not like he was one of the most surprising workouts at the combine to me, because when you watch the tape, he's not flying sideline to sideline, making dynamic plays. He's hitting the right gap. He's taking on blockers. He's kind of squatty. You said, you mentioned his size. I think he's 6 foot even, about 233, 235. So that almost suggests, in the modern NFL anyway, a little bit more of a Mike linebacker type. But then you read the scouting reports, and there's some, scouts have really good things to say about his coverage ability. And so I do think he fits in that sense. And also he's had a little bit of success getting to the quarterback. And remember what Mike McDonald talked about 2 weeks ago. He's like, if you play for me, you got to be able to blitz. And when you blitz, you got to be able to get home. And I do think that he's a possibility, especially because I really do believe, in as much as there's a couple of guys that are slated to fall in that second round range that I absolutely would love, we don't have a pick there. And we might not end up with a pick there. We might not have a shot at Peyton Wilson or Junior Colson or Trotter. There's some different.
Edgerrin Cooper is another guy in that, like
a guy that super great athlete. He's long. I don't love the tape. I'm not so sure about him, but there's some dudes later on that are interesting and that are more of that versatile mold. And I think that's why they're going to kind of wait on linebacker. It might make fans a little nervous because, you'd love to have a couple of guys out of this draft on 4-year contracts when Dodson and Baker are only on 1. But I think they're going to wait because I think that's where the value at linebacker is in this draft. And you can tell by the guys that they've met with that I think that's kind of the direction they're leaning. So he fits into that group. I think he's a guy that, day 3, could make a ton of sense and be in that rotation, play special teams, get some snaps early and be in sort of the long range vision right along there with, Jalen Ford, Cedric Gray, Nathaniel Watson, who they've met with, some of those guys. I think he's right in that tier.
There's another guy that has been like pretty popular among UW fans. And I'll tell you, when I decided he was going to be an NFL player was Jack Westover runs down a corner on a would-be pick 6. And I'm not telling you that guy is going to become a Pro Bowl tight end, but that guy has a spot on special teams in the NFL, in my opinion. And that's like a thing that if you can be, there's actually one, I want to make one other point about Penix. Maybe I'll make it now. I'll make it right now because the special teams thing brought it to my mind. Half the teams in the NFL carried 3 quarterbacks last year. I'm going to get back to this later, actually. Hold on. Sorry. Jack Westover runs down this dude, and I'm like, that guy's going to be an NFL player. And then everything I hear about him is all he is an H-back. He's not, I think you have
45, something like that.
Sure. So what is the dividing line? Tell me what makes him an H-back versus a tight end in the NFL. Why is everybody saying this? Because I just am like, it's ignorance. Why do people keep saying this? Why can't he play a more traditional tight end in the NFL?
I think it's kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier, where it's just, perception based on appearance. And he's
got it.
Top of my head, I think he's 6'3", 245, right? And that's just, everybody wants their tight ends to be, well, like Seahawks are having a top 30 visit this week with Theo Johnson from Penn State. He's 6'6", 255, 260, Cade Stover's kind of that size. Like, we loved Colby Parkinson's, his traits and his measurables. I think that's sort of what the image of a prototypical tight end is. It's hard for people to let go of those and accept something different. But what we have to look at is, I don't think NFL offenses are evolving by the minute, and in the way that they're using their tight ends have changed so much, and that there's a lot of value in a guy like that. Look at Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is 240 pounds. Mm-hmm. And he's being talked about like, certainly the best tight end prospect since Kyle Pitts and one of the best we've seen come along in the last 10 years. And yes, he's been an effective blocker, but he's not that mold. He's not a big dude. He's a guy that's too big to play wide receiver is kind of what he looks like to me. And so I don't really see the difference. I think it's just, It's hard to let go of those sort of long-term, kind of,
like you see a fast white guy and you're like, that's Chris Cooley, like an undersized, like, doesn't it feel a little bit like that where it's like, not
every 5'10" white receiver is Wes Welker.
Of course. Right? Yes, of course. Every single one.
No.
All right. I'm going to exercise the demon that popped into my head. It was like an intrusive thought about Penix that I'd almost let out. Did you read the Bill Barnwell article about how teams should be drafting more first round quarterbacks?
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'll send it to you after the podcast. The point of it is
because I certainly have thoughts.
Okay, yeah, because so the point of it is basically like because of the salary structure now, you can bust like if there's a 30% success rate, but the cost of that quarterback is so low compared to the average starter. You just keep drafting quarterbacks high because you have to have a quarterback, and then when that guy gets injured, you might have another quarterback behind him. The Seahawks trade for Sam Howell. They have Geno Smith on the roster, and people are like, okay, quarterback is set. And to me, this is where I was getting to is half the teams in the NFL carried 3 quarterbacks on their active roster last year. I got into an argument with a group of guys. I thought it was most teams carrying 2. It's 50-50. Now they don't have Nick.
Yeah, I thought it'd be less than that.
Yeah, I thought so too. I'm in this group chat of like degenerate gambling data nerds, and they were like, by the way, we were both wrong because one guy was like every team carries 3, and I was like barely any teams do. And I went and looked at active rosters in the NFL that day, not on injured reserve, like active rosters. 16 teams were carrying a third quarterback.
Yeah.
So the Seahawks this year don't have Nick Bellore on the roster. You probably can't carry a third quarterback and a special teams specialist. You know what I mean? It's harder to carry a quarterback if you're carrying like a long snapper, for example. And most teams, I think, at this point are carrying long snappers. The point that I'm getting at is I think that the Seahawks can carry a guy. I kind of think when they were in the market for Anthony Richardson last year, at least some of the stories suggested that. One of the things I thought that was interesting about him is I believe at the time, because Drew Lock was still under his rookie deal at that point, right? So he was on the roster, Geno Smith's on the roster, and it was like people were like, if they draft him, it's the end of Drew Lock. And to me, I thought there was an opportunity with a guy with Richardson's athletic prowess to go, you're going to sit. You're going to sit for a year and learn the offense. You'll get reps every week, but you're going to sit. What we will do is 8-10 snaps a game. You're going to come in and be on the field. You're going to run the ball. You're going to throw the ball. You're going to be like a mismatch somehow. And teams will have no idea what we're going to do with you. Like Taysom Hill, but like to say that Taysom Hill he's Taysom Hill. He makes Taysom Hill look like a high school player, basically, like the athlete that Anthony Richardson is. And if the Seahawks don't draft Michael Penix in the first round, which I would be totally fine with, is a guy like Joe Milton, who has been, I think, favorably compared to Anthony Richardson. I don't think he's not the athlete that Anthony Richardson was for sure. He's got a strong arm. And he is athletic. Is he athletic enough to be that guy, like a special package guy, and be like a 5th, 6th, maybe? I mean, I've seen stuff that has him 7th to undrafted. Right. Be a guy that you can bring in for packages like that.
Here's the problem. Joe Milton has a special arm. He does it in a different way. I feel like he's a little mechanical. He stands straight up, right? But the arm is special. The ball gets on you. Like it gets there in a hurry. The problem is the practice restrictions in the NFL today. You really can't develop a quarterback. You can't, because you just can't get in practice reps. You can barely get Drew Lock ready. And we saw that happen when Geno got hurt in that game and he had to come in. And it wasn't until the next week that he looked like, oh, okay, hey, he's taken some steps. He's improved. It's so hard to prepare. And so to ask now to try and develop a third quarterback, that's really tough. And I get it, because you're absolutely right. The rookie wage scale allows so much flexibility and the bust rate is so high. We see teams, the first team off the top of my head that I can remember doing this so quickly was how fast the Cardinals moved on from Josh Rosen, who was the 10th pick in the draft. And then 2 years later, they get the first pick because it all falls apart and they take Kyler Murray. We've seen that play out again this year in Chicago. It's I won't even mention the team in our division that we've seen do this. Anyway, it's because that's unfair. It's what am I trying to say? You can't develop a third quarterback. You just can't get him the practice reps. And so taking a guy like Joe Milton doesn't make a lot of sense anymore late in the draft, because he needs development. He's not ready to step in and play right away, but you can't give it to him. Now, I have suggested, and I did so on a show a couple weeks ago, talked about the Michael Penix thing. What if the obvious connections with Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff, if they love him as a pro prospect, because just because they loved him at UW doesn't necessarily mean they think he's going to be a great pro.
Sure.
And he does fall, then people might freak out and think, like we've talked about other positions, why did we do that? We got Sam Howell. Why did we get Sam Howell if we were going to take Michael Penix? Because now, in trying to find the hardest thing to find in football, you've now doubled your chances.
Yeah.
Two guys that have long-term winning starter quarterback upside, because I'm a big Sam Howell fan too. But you've basically doubled down at a position, giving yourself a better chance to succeed when next year's class doesn't look great. Yeah. And so why wouldn't you do that? It would make more sense with a guy like Penix because I think he's more mature. He's more advanced.
Yeah. So I think I always think of things in terms of probability. If Sam Howell has a 30% chance of becoming a quality starter in the NFL, maybe Penix has a 40% chance and Geno has like a 40% chance, and you sum those things up. And I fully agree. Another thing that I think people forget is in the early days of the Pete Carroll, John Schneider duo, they traded for Charlie Whitehurst at the chagrin of Matt Hasselbeck. They signed Tavares Jackson, who supplanted Charlie Whitehurst. They signed Matt Flynn, theoretically to replace Tavares Jackson and Charlie Whitehurst and Matt Hasselbeck. And then they drafted Russell Wilson. He didn't get dropped from the heavens. He got dropped from the third round of the NFL draft, and it was controversial when they I was pissed. One, when they drafted him. I wanted Kirk Cousins, which feels like I've been vindicated to a degree on that. He's been a very good quarterback in the NFL, but it was controversial when they picked him. It was controversial when they let him start after dominating preseason. Obviously, I know that we've decided that Russell Wilson has always sucked somehow. It's so annoying to me because he was great early in his career. He shows signs of greatness now on occasion, and I think that I'm like very. I think he's going to do great in Pittsburgh. By the way, that's an aside for sure.
Fit. Yeah, I think it's good. It's probably the best fit that's out there for him.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know who really could use a guy like Russell Wilson, a cheap quarterback. With his credentials, is the Denver Broncos. They really seem to need a guy like him. Anyway, that's obviously a joke. That's the thing that's been frustrating, and I kind of hope. And then this will have come out after because I'm going to my family's going to Disneyland this week, so I'm pre-recording. So this will have come out already, but. The Seahawks are one of the first teams in the NFL that haven't coddled the quarterback position, in my opinion. What you have to do now in the NFL is you draft a first-round quarterback with, let's say, a 30% probability of success. And then, like you are married to the most, like you're married to Mike Pence, you have to be like, I've never even seen another quarterback. I don't know what other quarterbacks look like. I don't look at other quarterbacks. Like, you have to pretend like no other quarterbacks exist. You have to bring in the least threatening backup to that quarterback. And the Seahawks have never done that. They've made it a competition until Russell Wilson signed a big deal, and then they stopped drafting quarterbacks. Yeah. And in the Green Bay thing, what people don't appreciate about that is there was friction in Green Bay with Brett Favre and multiple quarterbacks. Obviously, the biggest one is Aaron Rodgers. There was friction in Green Bay when they drafted Jordan Love, but they've had a 30+ year stretch of great quarterbacks, we'll see what Jordan Love turns into. He looked pretty good this year. Yeah, they've had a 30+ year stretch of success at the quarterback position. But again, it's not because they hit 3 times in a row. They drafted a bunch of quarterbacks to reach that point. The Patriots did the same thing. To me, the thing about do they need Michael Penix or not is irrelevant. He gives you another flip of the coin,
Yeah, and it goes back to that article you referenced. It's such a sound philosophy, and even during those Green Bay years you mentioned, the guys that didn't end up being franchise quarterbacks, they got value for that. They traded Aaron Brooks for picks. They traded Mark Brunell for picks. They did Ty Detmer. They had, some of those guys turned into quality players that were coveted by other teams. It's, man, the trouble with it though is you kind of feel like to really pull that off, you have to get ahead of the curve. And it feels like in the draft, when it comes to the quarterback position, the Seahawks have been working from behind. They had the opportunity with the extra picks that came in the Russell Wilson trade, but they were bad quarterback drafts. They didn't have an opportunity. Thank God they didn't use one of those picks on Kenny Pickett. Or do you remember the mock drafts that year when Malik Willis was going to be our pick at 9?
Oh, yeah. I remember a lot of presently very smug people being pissed they didn't draft him in the first round, the second round, the third. Yeah. I think did they get 3 cracks at Malik Willis and not pick him anytime?
And that's the same draft. Sam Howell, they passed on him just because they felt like they had so many other needs and they were kind of restarting the roster there. And last year, I think those reports are legitimate that Anthony Richardson was high on their board and they might have taken him. But I think he would have sat. And I think the Colts made a mistake playing him right away, not just because he got hurt. I just didn't think he was ready. And so I kind of envisioned a role like you did, where you have him available, kind of come in and do some of that stuff. But it's just, it's so hard now because I almost feel like, sadly, the opportunity to find a franchise guy late in the draft, even on day 2 anymore, is evaporating. Because if you're coming out and you're in college, you have some eligibility left, and you submit your name to the NFL advisory committee, and they say you're a day 2 pick. Okay, what's that contract look like? It's all set in stone. I'm going to make a couple $100,000 a year. What am I going to get to stay at Georgia? What am I going to get to stay at Oregon or Oklahoma? I'll get that.
Great point.
And maybe I can come back and be a first-round pick next year. And so, there are some guys in this draft that I like as developmental prospects. If his leg's healthy, I love Jordan Travis. Not sold. I'm kind of ambivalent. I go back and forth on Spencer Rattler. There aren't a lot of guys because most of those guys that I was hoping would come out this year and really sort of deep in this draft didn't, because they got paid to stay.
Yeah.
And so it's, you can take it, Jordan Travis, but how are you going to develop him? You're just not. And that's, we can get into a whole nother discussion about how, I'm encouraged by the fact that there's an opportunity to have a successful spring league now that they've consolidated forces. But until they make it a priority to give those quarterback spots to young guys that have a chance to develop, and stop giving those spots to guys like Luis Perez again, that's a missed opportunity. It's just so hard to develop anyone that you take after the first round. Yeah.
All right, we can stop with it's been very Penix focused, and I feel like that's got to be tiresome for a lot of people. Yeah, well, yeah, and I would love to. There is another. So you were the person. I saw you say Braylon Trice is 245. That's got to be a typo on Twitter.
I thought it was.
Yeah, and then when you said that, I was like, because I had never looked up his size, but you'd see him on the field, and he looked like a guy who was like a college defensive tackle on the field.
275,
yeah, and he looked every bit of 275. Like, I was not surprised to see that was his listed weight. We know listed weights, listed heights. There's some fudging that goes on. I understand that. I'm not. That's not what I was worried about. But like, so. I want you to tell me about Brennan Jackson, the edge rusher from Washington State. I want to not make it fully Huskies focused. I think he's probably is he the best prospect from Washington State this year? I know there's a couple defensive backs that are.
No, I think Jaden Hicks is. I think Hicks has a chance to go in the second round. I think he has a chance.
To yeah.
Taken after Tyler Nubin, probably. I think Jaden Hicks would be a marvelous fit for Mike McDonald. I just think he's going to go in that range where we really don't have a pick. Let me just touch on that Braylon Trice thing, though. That's interesting that you remember that, because 5 minutes after I tweeted that it was a typo, like, I turn on the combine and there's Daniel Jeremiah saying, no, he's 245. Wow, we were really surprised he showed up at that weight. Yeah. It's become a thing where guys try to drop weight to test better. I think it's dumb. I don't know if there's an example of it paying off for anybody yet. Mike Morris tried that last year, and then as soon as the Seahawks took him, they said, "Start eating. Get back up to 300 pounds. You can eat whatever you want." And Trice even coming in at 30 pounds lighter didn't test particularly well. So his stock has fallen. I've heard some things recently. It seems like there's some buzz out there that he was really sick, and that might have kind of contributed. to it, but who knows what he is now? That would be the interesting part, because he is a guy that, even though he doesn't have the gaudy sack numbers, that his pressure rate numbers were outstanding, and you can see the skill on tape. If they are indeed looking for bigger edges, which it sounds like they are, he would certainly fit into that. Brennan Jackson's a guy that I love. I think he's been underrated this entire process, although he seems, at least in the mock draft simulator community, it seems like, I've seen some buzz out there that maybe he's got an outside shot to get on to day 2, but maybe earlier in day 3 than I thought. He's got all the athletic ability. I think he's 6'3", 6'4", 260, long arms, and just checks all the boxes for character. He's a guy that could have gone pro last year and gotten drafted, came back because he thought they had a chance to win some things this year. Never entered the portal, was devoted to Pullman. He's a family guy, has all those responsibilities off the field taken care of. But the thing I like about Brennan Jackson isn't just the speed at that size, like he's a 4.8 40 guy, but just, you never have to question the motor. I mean, he absolutely plays with his hair on fire all the time. And in that sense, I'm not saying he's this player, but the effort on tape reminds me of when I first turned on the college tape of Max Crosby at was it Eastern Michigan or Western Michigan? And I thought, wow, who's this guy? He plays that hard, and I think he's being underrated, and I think he's going to be great value in an edge class that, after the first round and a half, like, really falls off a cliff.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that he tests athletically better than Braylon Trice, despite the dropping weight, and obviously there's the potential illness, which I don't want to speculate on any of that, but like, if that's the case, that's the case, and maybe that diminished the. I didn't see. Did he not participate in the pro day? I can't remember what the story was on him at the pro day. I saw that he was preparing for the pro day. Yeah,
I don't remember anything coming out of the pro day. It was all about Penix that day.
Yeah, and anyway, so yeah, I think you'd have had those guys flip flopped. I remember I was thinking Braylon Trice might sneak into the first round or the early second round at a point, and then he turns into this guy who's like, I don't know what the fit is, like a slow, smaller edge. Like, that's not a guy that I see a spot for on many rosters.
I feel like he's got to be 275, 280.
Yeah.
In order to be, what we think he is.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk to you about 2 prospects that I find intriguing and confusing at the same time. And I want to know if they, I think one guy has like a pretty obvious, like, probably relatively early spot, and another guy I see on mocks high. I can't imagine what position he's going to play. So Brandon Dorlus is kind of the guy that we thought Braylon Trice was going to be. Like a big kind of hybrid. Like, again, he's a guy that, is he going to be on the line? Is he going to be an edge rusher? Is he going to be both? One, is it a scheme fit in Seattle? 2, how good is that dude? Because he seems pretty great to me.
He's a guy that Michael Thompson, my buddy, who writes for 12th Man Rising. I've had him on the show a bunch of times. He studies the draft really heavily. He's been a Dorlus fan for a long time. So as we've traded mock drafts over the last 6-7 months, he's a guy that keeps coming back to that. And so I've gone back and I've watched the tape over and over again. And I feel like he's kind of as far as defensive linemen go anyway, sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. Even Matty Brown was talking about it today, that they put him, they'll line him up over the center, and then they'll line him up wide. And even in that wide 9 kind of stuff that we see the Eagles do a lot of. And when he lines up wide, he's surprisingly effective for a guy who's, I think he's 285, 290, that, real quick and a real smooth mover, good get off. But when he moves inside, he gets swallowed up, and he doesn't beat blocks, and he doesn't move guys, and he doesn't impact the pocket. He's one of those guys that I have no idea. I think he used the word confused. I mean, it's a mystery to me. He's one of those that I've just kind of set to the side. And if the Seahawks take him, I certainly don't think they'll take him in the first round. I don't think he's a first round guy. But if they trade down, right, or if he slips into the third round and they take him, I'm going to reserve judgment, because they must have a plan for him, and they must see something that's going to allow him to fit into their system. Maybe that's you add 10, 15 pounds, make him 305, and he becomes Justin Matabuike. Like, he could do that, or you take a little weight off and make him even more dynamic and keep him on the edge. Yeah, he's a mystery to me too.
All right, and then the last guy, he's I literally can't stop. James Williams, the Miami linebacker slash safety, and he's a guy that's like, he'd be an enormous. Well, I mean, he would be an enormous safety, and not in the way that because I remember when Cam Chancellor got drafted, and I was not like, I'm not like a guy who's out grinding tape, by the way. Like, I'll watch a little bit and be like, oh, what does this guy do? A lot of times it's highlights, which is an unfair way to really gauge a guy. So I don't pretend to be a guy who's grinding tape. I'll listen to what people who grind tape say and kind of create an aggregate in my mind. And that's good enough for me because I'm not trying to be and do all the work that you do, frankly. Like, you put in a lot of work that I don't want to do. I want to be informed. James Williams is a guy who's 6'5", listed somewhere like 235. When Cam Chancellor got drafted, I remember going like, well, ton of upside with the size, speed, weight, the like athletically gifted dude. Maybe he's going to have to play linebacker. I thought that about Cam Chancellor. Obviously, he became one of the best safeties in football for several years. And then James Williams, you watch the highlights or you watch whatever, and he's like flying all over the field, and he's in the backfield and making these crazy plays, and then he tests, frankly, terribly.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm looking at this guy, and I'm like, at one point I was like, you're going to have to decide between a guy who's probably not a modern safety or a guy who's like, maybe he's got enough coverage skills to be this like linebacker we're talking about, or something that they could do. I don't know, like a dude with and then he doesn't show up and test well, and you're like, is he an NFL player? Is he just lifetime special teamer at some point and in the safety or linebacker depth chart? Or is this a guy that you can get up to 250 and turn him into oh man, why is the guy's name? Oh, Shaquem Griffin.
More as a linebacker now.
Yeah.
Mock draft simulators, which is interesting.
Can you make him into Shaquem Griffin? I guess that's like he has like almost 3 position projections because he's got edge, height, and maybe length. I don't think his arms are that long, but
it's funny that you brought up those two names because we didn't talk about these two guys before we started recording today. They are two of the most polarizing and perplexing prospects in this entire draft. At the beginning of the draft season, James Williams was a favorite among Seahawks, Twitter and Seahawks mock draft sim community, where just because, here's a big, tall, rangy, athletic safety, like that's exciting. And just to talk about my process a little bit, thank you for the kind words, but I'm similar to you, I think, more so than I am, to Daniel Jeremiah, in the sense that as much as I would love to wake up every day and punch in and spend 8 hours going through prospect by prospect, position group by position group, watching a minimum of 3 games for every prospect, I don't have the time to do that. And so I typically I'll see something said about a player. Jim Nagy will tweet something, or Corbin Smith will say something, or Brady Henderson, or I'll just see that the Seahawks are having someone in for a visit, or there's been contact, and I'll go look at that player. I do subscribe to an all 22 database, and I have that at my disposal. And then when I do have time, I'll just try to look for guys that I think are fits. And when you watch James Williams, he's that classic player of, if you just go to YouTube and type in James Williams and you look at highlights, you can get pretty excited about him, right? But then guys like him that have that kind of athletic profile or size and length traits, that once you get into the draft season, if the arrow isn't pointing up, like if they don't start trending up, then you have to ask yourself why. And he didn't make a splash at the Senior Bowl. He didn't hardly even garner any conversation at the combine from these guys to stand out from the safety group. You don't see him moving up any draft boards. Could that mean he's a sleeper? Maybe. But there was a guy, and this is telling because I cannot remember his name. There's a guy that came out of Boise State last year. Same thing. Big, tall. Do you remember this? Big, tall safety.
Yeah, who was that?
And he had every Seahawk mock drafter had him going to us in the second round all day long last year. Can't remember where he went, but what does that tell you? Didn't make an impact as a rookie, went lower than everybody expected him to. I think in this day and age, and especially with what we know about Mike McDonald and the scheme he intends to run, he wants interchangeability, he wants versatility. We're getting away from that. Talk to Paul Moyer about this today. You're not going to see Cam Chancellor, Earl Thomas again. You're not going to see the box guy and the center fielder. It's about more too high, everybody being interchangeable so the offense doesn't know who's coming or who's doing what. Guys, safeties that can play the slot, cover tight ends and running backs. And corners and safeties are starting to look more alike than different. And so he seems like an odd fit, kind of a square peg, round hole kind of a thing.
JL Skinner is the guy you were thinking of.
That's him. Yeah. 6'4", right?
Yep. 6'4", he's 220, so a little bit smaller. And then I'm trying to get they have an athleticism score, but I don't see any testing numbers right now. But we don't need to do that on the podcast. Do you think there's a chance? Am I insane to? And he went 6th round to the Denver Broncos, by the way.
Okay. 6th round. He was a second rounder all day. As far as mock drafters were concerned, up until
Is there a chance a guy like James Williams, can he get up to 250 and be an edge?
Maybe, or kind of that hybrid outside linebacker. Now I'm having a hard time remembering names. Who's the dude? I loved him for the Seahawks last year too. The kind of tweener outside linebacker out of Texas, Overshown. Demarion Overshown. Is that the name? Tore his knee up last year, but went to Dallas, I think 2nd or 3rd round. Same kind of long, 6'4", 235 though, kind of underweighted.
Yeah.
But a guy that can move around, drop into coverage, come off the edge, sort of be that hybrid. It seems to me like that would be his best fit. I don't know if you're going to make him like a defensive end type of edge, because that edge definition, is kind of fluid these days. But maybe sort of, which may mean that he's just a sub package type guy. But that's maybe kind of the profile that we're looking at there is Overshown. Because
the coverage is the problem for him as a safety, right? He James Williams, not a great coverage safety.
The rest of the class,
right? Yeah. But to me, you're like, how bad is it? Is it as bad as the average edge? Because if the Seahawks are going to be occasionally dropping those guys into coverage, you have to imagine a guy that played D1 college safety is probably better in coverage than most of the edge prospects in this draft. And to me, it's like the problem with him is he's like a classic guy that when you I used to play a lot of NCAA football on PlayStation, and you'd get a guy every now and then in your recruiting class that was just athlete, and he's 6'2". We don't know where to put him. You get to choose his position, which is fun. Well, that's fun when he's 18 to 22 and you're developing a guy, but you're coming to an NFL roster, having a defined position would be good, right? So I understand this. Yeah. To me, you're like, this is a guy that's very intriguing if he goes undrafted. If they draft him anything earlier than the 6th or 7th round, I'm like, I think there's something. I think you could find a way to make this guy a good NFL player. He's got athletic traits that are off the charts, and then there's just no place to put him. It seems insane to me.
Again, though, we talked about this in regards to the quarterbacks. I think it applies to other positions too. They're just so few reps that developing players, we went through this for years with the Seahawks, right? They loved drafting guys and trying to change their positions, right? We saw that with a lot of linemen. We saw it with
Jamison Collins was a big one.
Jamison Collins, that's the name I was trying to think of. He was such a dynamic athlete. They're like, let's take him and we'll make something out of him, right? I think they tried him at tight end. They tried him at defensive end. Then there was the big receiver we drafted at LSU, Stephen. It was a 7th round pick a couple years ago. I can't remember the last name. Stephen. Anyway, 6'5", and he was
Stephen
a receiver.
Sullivan.
Yeah, they tried to make a tight end out of him, and then they tried to make a defensive end out of him. They're just, it's such a challenge trying to get those guys to be able to change position. Where if you're in the 7th round, and as John Schneider said, hey, late in the draft we do draft for need, and they feel like we need to add another competitive edge. Well, why wouldn't you go Jalen Harrell or Braden McGregor out of Michigan, guys that have been playing edge for a long time and are kind of in that range that have familiarity with this game? Why go project there unless you're talking about undrafted free agents? And if he does fall through, I think he's probably a guy that's going to get a lot of phone calls.
Yeah. So that's actually, you bring that up and you accidentally buy yourself another question. There's like 18 combine invites, I think, from Michigan. I think 13 from Washington. And there's some guys that are like in the draft discussion that were not invited to the combine. And there's obviously familiarity with, I mean, frankly, there's familiarity. And you actually said this on your podcast the other day, which is Dominique Hampton, even though Ryan Grubb didn't coach defense, he's familiar with Dominique Hampton. If he's available late, he's going to have some sort of a report to give to. And then obviously Mike McDaniel coached at Michigan a couple of years ago. There's going to be a ton of familiarity. I'm sure he's able to talk to
Jay Harbaugh.
Jay Harbaugh, and I'm sure he's got enough of a rapport with Jim Harbaugh that at some point they've had a conversation about some of the guys. By the way, Bale Breaker Field 41, watched you drink it. It's had the beer at my wedding. I know you work in the booze industry. Also, great choice of beer. It's one of my favorite beers in the history of beer. Sorry to derail once again. Over under. What's that?
It's my first time drinking it. Just picked it up.
Is it really?
At the market across the street. Yeah.
Wow.
I've had their IPAs, but I've never had their pale. And I specifically was looking at this little mini market. I live in the city in Seattle, and there's all these little corner markets around me. But I was feeling lazy tonight, so I just went to the one right across the street from my apartment. And they have like 15 IPAs, and then they have a couple light beers. And I don't drink IPAs anymore. It's too much. I can't do it.
Sure. I'm reaching this point in my life. It's very sad.
I was like, you don't have a pale ale. And I finally found it was like tucked back in the corner.
So it used to be like 4.4% alcohol, but drink like a full flavored IPA. And now it's, I think, like 5.3 or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, I specifically checked that because, I picked up a Kona beer that looked good. It was a lager, and I thought, I want something light, but it was 4.4. I said, I'm not going to do that tonight.
Yeah. Well, so the Field 41, we had it at our wedding. It was like the one thing that I really pounded the table for was to have Field 41 or Bale Breaker Field 41. I think I had about 13 of them at my wedding. And it's good that it's 4.4% because you could drink a fair amount of them. And anyway, over under.
If they would have made the switch without you knowing, like as that was happening.
I'm just like
a whole different night.
My clothes are off at the reception. It's very easy in mocks, I think, to go, well, here's a Michigan guy. Here's a Michigan defensive player. Yeah. Obviously, he plays for the Seahawks now. There's a dude, I can't think of the name of Chris, what's the tackle? Chris Jenkins? Is that his name? The dude
for Michigan?
The defensive tackle, Chris.
Chris Jenkins. Yeah.
Chris Jenkins. And I like everything I've read makes it seem like maybe not a perfect fit for what the Seahawks are going to do, but he played for Michigan. So it's like really easy to go like he played for Michigan, he should play for the Seahawks. And maybe he will. What's your over under?
Yeah, it's my over under on Michigan players.
Michigan and Washington players combined. Because I think you're like, if the Seahawks don't draft Fautanu in the first round, like Rosengarten in the later rounds, if he's still available, becomes a guy you're like, well, that makes sense. Like he's a guy that's there that makes sense. But,
Hampton. Yeah. That's the crazy thing is between the two schools, especially Michigan, almost every single one of those 18 combine invites for Michigan would be fits,
Sure.
Except, maybe Blake Corum doesn't fit. Maybe Roman Wilson doesn't fit.
Does Roman Wilson not fit? Because he's a guy that I keep sneaking in. I feel like he's, I had a great comparison for Roman Wilson that I wanted to drop on you. If we would have had 5 hours to do this, I'd had a lot more, but I can't.
Well, I think it goes back to our earlier conversation that I've been telling people for a long time that, signing Laviska Shenault to a guaranteed vet minimum deal might change this equation, because up until that happened, I was pretty adamant that don't be surprised they're going to draft a receiver at some point in this draft.
Yeah.
Right? This makes all the sense for the points we were making earlier, but no, Roman Wilson I'd find room for him on the roster.
Sure.
But the fits are amazing, especially on the Michigan side. Like all 6 of those offensive linemen, any one of them would make sense. And they've met with Trevor Keegan and Kason Barnhart and Zach Zinter. And, they're looking at those guys. And Junior Colson is an obvious fit. Chris Jenkins, the athletic profile, they call him the mutant, and he's a leader in that locker room. You know, he's a dude that could help sort of set the culture. And then, you know, JJ McCarthy, we've talked about him, but let's see. Let me answer it this way then. We have 7 picks. I fully anticipate that at the end of the day, we're going to end up with 9. I think he's going to trade down. I think he's going to accumulate extra picks. I think he wants to get extra couple more picks in that top 100 because that's the meat of this draft. So let's say it's 9. I'll put the over under. You're talking combined Huskies and Wolverines?
Yep.
I could pussy out and say 1.5.
I appreciate that for calling it that.
I mean, look, I'll say 2.5, and here's why. Sometimes the best answer is the easy one. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes that connection matters because they're outstanding prospects. Like if they can get Zach Zinter in the 3rd round, if that leg's 100%, he's plug and play starting guard long term from day one. You can say the same probably about Trevor Keegan, who you can get a round or 2 lower, and he can play some tackle. There are other 2 tackles. Barnhart is one, and who's the other one? Demarius? Is it? Anyway, I don't have all these names in the top of my head. I'm not quite Mel Kiper when it comes to total recall. But yeah, Chris Jenkins fits. Junior Colson fits. You could sneak Roman Wilson in there. Mike Sainristil fits. Like he's probably going to go in the 2nd round, not going to get a shot at him. He's a smaller slot, but he is the alpha dog in that locker room and an absolute culture setter. So
I could see, like, is it Cornelius Johnson, the guy, the other receiver that's like probably a late, 7th-ish round where you're like, people aren't going to be mad they're taking a receiver that late. But he's also a guy who, like, theoretically profiles as a guy who's going to play outside, where I think Roman Wilson might have a little bit of overlap with that's the biggest thing, is he's got some overlap with JSN to me that maybe makes him not as desirable.
Asper.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about that guy. I think it's because he looks like I don't know. He look in baseball, like there's shortstops. Khalil Green, I think, was one of these guys that they would just call him dirtbags. And it's like a dude that's just going to go out and do everything to win. It's like Roman Wilson isn't testing off the charts with really anything. He's fast, but he's not Worthy. Xavier Worthy's fast. He is fast, but he's not that. He's not a guy who's like going to go up and he's not a track star, you know what I mean?
Right.
But he's going to go out and just do everything. Like he's just going to be a pain in the ass for the team that's playing against him. And that's what it felt like, by the way, that whole national championship game was like, he was just like, God damn it, can you stop this one guy? So if you set the over under to 2.5, are you taking the over or the under, and who are your like top 3 or 4 guys that it could be?
God, in a year where there's a pretty steep drop off and the depth isn't there like it is in other years. Like this hopefully it's the last year we'll see like this, but it's certainly the last year that's going to be impacted by, we'll have seen the last of the 6-year seniors. We'll have seen the last of the COVID guys. And the NIL thing, I think over time is going to start to balance out a little bit. That if I can get familiarity, like remember when we would have drafts early in Pete Carroll's tenure, and even if they weren't necessarily guys that played for him at USC, although there were many, many examples of guys that he took, there was that fresh familiarity with those players for those first couple of years that they leaned on pretty heavily.
Yeah.
And so why wouldn't you when they fit and they're outstanding prospects? You reach for a guy just because he played for you. Well, that's not a good move. That would have led to Taylor Mays being the choice instead of Earl Thomas,
which I wanted, by the way.
A lot of people did.
Yeah.
History certainly has borne out that we made the right move, but totally different players, of course. And I remember when the move was made at the time, I wasn't as familiar with Earl Thomas. I thought he's tiny. I think it came up with Taylor Mays, who's a freaking Hulk.
Yeah.
But no, I think it makes all the sense in the world when you're trying to especially on defense and on the offensive line, because the matches are just pure. If you can get back into the 2nd round, I could even see them. Let's say that they trade into the late 20s. Let's say they trade with Buffalo, right? Buffalo has their eyes on a receiver at 16 that they just absolutely think is the guy that they need to add after moving on from Stephon Diggs and losing Gabe Davis. And they want to make the big jump. And we actually do recoup a 2nd round pick, because it's harder than people think when you look at the trade charts.
Yeah.
And and they think Junior Colson's going to be gone by the end of the second round. I could see them, even though nobody is projecting him to sneak into the first round, I could see them taking him at 28 because he's such a perfect fit and he's so young, and they're thinking about the future, and they know that they're going to miss out on him, and he's at the top of their board, and they're not going to get a chance to take him again. I could see them, reaching for a guy like that just because of the familiarity and because the fit's so perfect.
Yeah. So wait, but you got to give me your. Would you take the over, and who are the? Who would be the three?
Take the over. I'll take the over. Right. I think no. Let's talk realistic, like within their range, right? Like I think if I'm at 16 and Fautanu falls to 16, I know I've said it. I don't think they'll take an offensive lineman early for the reasons I stated earlier. That's my guy.
Got it.
And I can see them doing it too because he's a no-brainer. That guy's going to be potentially an all-pro at guard. You just take good players, right? Take the best player that you can. If he falls to 16, I'd be shocked if he's not at the top of their board when John looks up. And so I think that's an obvious one that fits into that range. I think Zinter is another one that could be there at 81, that if he is and they didn't go guard early, would make all the sense in the world, right? If Trice falls to 81, he would make a lot of sense. And then name the other offensive lineman, right? I think Trevor Keegan would make sense. I think Kason Barnhart makes sense. I think you mentioned Rosengarten. At 81, even he might make sense. I'm not sure if he's ever played any guard or if he can, but I know he's a little heavier now than he was. He was listed under 300 during his time at UW. I think he's 305 was the last I saw. Really athletic guy that can move. We can talk about the idea of Lucas moving inside or just hedging against that in case that knee is chronic and he doesn't fully come back from that. And so those are some of the guys that I think make the most sense. And I think Chris Jenkins does. The production wasn't there, but everything you read about him is he's fantastic against the run. We've heard McDonald talk over and over again this offseason about how that's a priority. He's phenomenal athletically to the point that you think there's more in the tank when it comes to getting to the quarterback there. And that kind of physically, I'll use this reference again. He could be Justin Madubuike, right? But also just big time leader to add to that rotation and a guy that they can grow with. Those are some of those guys.
I'm going to give you one guy that I feel like is, I don't know what round, it feels like he's destined to become a Seahawk, is AJ Barner. To me, it feels like almost like the Will Dissly of Michigan, where you're like, never did anything of like, where do you fit him? I don't know, but he seems like he just feels like a Seahawk to me. And obviously they don't have a full array of tight ends at this point. So I feel like there's going to be a tight end at some point in, they're going to bring in somebody from almost every position, probably among the undrafted free agents. So that's like not, but I mean like a high priority undrafted free agent or somewhere between like round 4 and 7, there will probably be a tight end that gets drafted. And he seems like a guy that like, one, there's going to be familiarity with. Also, I know like Devin Culp and Jack Westover have familiarity with Ryan Grubb, but this feels like, I don't know, it just feels like the Will Dissly, like 7-year Seahawks tight end that we can never seem to get rid of at any point. He just sticks around and is productive and is annoying to me because I don't think he's actually that good, but is just here forever,
Kind of reminds me a little bit of that John Carlson profile where, he's that size that you expect out of a tight end. I think 6'5", 255, 260. Like I don't think he's known as like a dominant blocker, but he's capable and he's willing. He's not the most explosive athlete, but he runs good enough routes. He has good enough hands. Like he's just one of those guys that carves out a 10-year career in the NFL, probably bouncing around to a couple different teams, but can be a good solid tight end. And when you look at that room now, they bring back Noah Fant. They give him $21 million over 2 years. It's what some people have called an overpay, but presumably because he's going to be featured more and you're going to get the most out of him. What does he do best? It's the elite athleticism. Let's see him get down the field a little bit more in this Ryan Grubb offense. He's a passable blocker, but it's not his strength. And then you bring in Pharaoh Brown, who John Schneider says he thinks is one of the top 5 blockers in the entire NFL, but a guy who also has some upside in the passing game. He's a taller dude. And then after that, you get down to Brady Russell and Tyler Mabry, right? Who apparently has a lifetime contract to be on the Seahawks practice squad. And so a guy like Barner makes a lot of sense. You know, he's a guy that Eric All is another guy kind of like in that range out of Iowa, similar profile. You know, just really good, solid all around tight end, which in this class is about as good as it gets because it kind of lacks after Brock Bowers anyway. It kind of lacks that top end talent.
Yep. All right. Well, Dan Viens, thank you so much. I'll let you get back to a night of drinking Bailbreaker Field 41s. Thank you for doing it. We finally made it happen. We didn't even get
too much.
We didn't even get into the saga of how we ended up doing this podcast, but I appreciate your time. You were very generous with it, and this will come out on Thursday, so cool. I'll tweet it out. Thank you. I'm going to play the music, and then I'm happy to talk to you for a moment after. But
it was fun. I knew it would be. Thanks for having me on, and we'll have to bring you on my show next.
Oh, absolutely. I would love that. I hope that I have something to offer. We'll see. All right. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, buddy.